Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, Victor. It's an honor to be here. First of all, Matsumoto-san just said, you may wake up and suddenly all your bank accounts are gone. No, not in HSBC. Secondly, if you want to know how complicated is multilateralism, just try to pronounce the word 5 times in 3 seconds, then you know. So today I'd like to take this opportunity to call for a reformation, a 21st century reformation of the current multilateral system. Multilateralism, as we know it, is more than 70 years old. No one doubts that it has delivered major economic and social progress around the world. Yet, a growing number of people feel that multilateralism in its current form has been outdated. If it is to survive and thrive, multilateralism must be reformed. It must be reformed to serve an increasing multipolar world, and it must be reformed with a more prominent role for Asia. Let me begin with some observations on the current trade dispute. So far, the US has imposed tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese imports, which is nearly half of the goods that China sold to the US every year. The US-China trade relationship is arguably the world's most important, so it's natural that the US-China trade dispute has captured the world's attention. But let's not forget, traditional US allies such as Canada and the EU have not been exempted. In fact, tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico remain in place, even though the US, Mexico, and Canada recently signed the USMCA. Imposing tariffs to deal with trade imbalances is not a new tactic for the US. In the 1980s, it had similar issues with Japan and West Germany, which ultimately led to the Plaza Accord in 1985. Many of you may remember some 30-odd years ago, the US wasn't happy with Japan and West Germany growing trade surpluses with the US. So much so that the US considered passing a bill that would impose punitive tariffs on Japanese imports. So Japan was afraid that it would lose access to the US market, so it allowed the yen to appreciate in return for the withdrawal of the bill. The Deutschmark also rose sharply against the US dollar. Currency appreciation has a similar effect to imposing tariffs. After the Plaza Accord was signed, Japanese and German products became more expensive as a result of a stronger yen and a stronger Deutschmark, respectively. While today imposing tariffs has the effect of raising the price of Chinese goods for the US consumers, but there's a major difference between the two episodes. Back then, the US was a few years away from becoming the only superpower in the unipolar world, whereas now it's just one of several great powers in an increasingly multipolar world order. In the 1940s, as the leader of the Western Bloc, the US spearheaded the creation of multilateral institutions such as the IMF and what are now the World Bank and the WTO. In broad strokes, and at the risk of oversimplifying more than 70 years of history, the West won. The Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union dissolved. The US-led multilateral institutions began to admit former communist countries, including Russia. And for a decade or so, the US was the only superpower in the unipolar world. The US dominated economic thinking and policy making. It called for deepening of the economic and financial linkages in the world, which led to a global boost in production and consumption. In short, US-led multilateralism facilitated the spread of globalization. In case you're wondering where China was in all this, there had always been an important role reserved for China. For example, near the end of World War II, the concept of the 4 policemen had China, along with the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, policing the world. The Big Four ultimately formed the core of the United Nations. However, it wasn't until 40 years ago when China started to reform and open up its economy and began its full return to the global arena. Multilateral cooperation and integration have been instrumental to the world's economic and social progress. Yet, These gains have also catalyzed the creation of an increasingly multipolar world. The rise of China is a perfect example. 40 years ago, China was home to about 1/4 of the world's population, but it was responsible for only 5% of the world's economic output. Since then, the gap has narrowed considerably. Today, China's share of global population is about 18%, while its share of global GDP is 15%. It is the world's second largest trader of goods and services, and last year it was the third largest source of foreign direct investment behind the US and Japan. But China is just one example of the rise of emerging markets. HSBC Global Research predicts that by 2030, China will be the largest economy in the world. India will be the third largest. ASEAN put together will be bigger than many, if not all, of the European economies. And over the next decade or so, roughly 70% of the global growth will come from emerging markets. So within our lifetime, the world will have gone from being bipolar to unipolar to multipolar. Never again will a single superpower dominate the world the way the US did between the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of China. The world order has evolved, and so must multilateralism. There are two main problems with the multilateralism in its current form. The first is that it has become unwieldy. I'll use the WTO as an example. In 1948, when it was born, there were 23 founding members. Today, there are 164. I think in your own company, you will know that if there are more than 10 people in a meeting, nothing moves. The more members there are, the more difficult it is to reach an agreement. In the case of the WTO, the sheer number of the developing countries that have joined makes reform necessary. The inability to conclude the Doha round trade negotiation is merely a symptom of the problem. This is partly as a result of the glacial progress at the multilateral level, and there's been an increased attention and activity at a regional level. In the Asia-Pacific basin, CPTPP was signed by the remaining 11 countries despite US withdrawal. Within Asia-Pacific, RCEP negotiations continue among 16 countries. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is the most ambitious plan yet to drive global trade and investment outside the current multilateral framework. Countries are increasingly operating outside the multilateral framework and settling disputes in their own way. And this is reflected in business sentiment, which impacts the decision that businesses make. HSBC recently surveyed more than 8,500 companies around the world, and we found that nearly 2/3 feel that the governments are becoming more protective of the domestic businesses. This was slightly higher than about 6 months ago when we last did the survey. Due partially to increased protectionism, companies are turning their attention to intra-regional trade rather than inter-regional trade. As an example, intra-regional trade in Asia today is equal to Asia's trade with Europe plus Asia's trade with NAFTA, and it continues to grow. Over the course of 6 months, the number of North American companies who are targeting Asia as their future growth market fell by 18 percentage points, while the number of Asian countries who are targeting North America as their future growth market fell by 8 percentage points. This is a clear signal from the business community that the geopolitical barriers are getting higher, and that companies are looking closer to home for opportunities. The second and more severe problem with multilateralism is that it hasn't kept up with the times. Look who gets to lead the multilateral institutions. The managing director of IMF has always been European. The president of the World Bank has always been American. Or look at who gets to vote. At the IMF, Italy has more votes than India, even though India's economy is more than 1/3 bigger. While Japan has more votes than China, even though China's economy is 3 times of that of Japan. However, it must be noted that IMF has undertaken major reforms in recent years. More than 6% of the votes have been reallocated from overrepresented countries to emerging markets. There's been a Chinese deputy managing director at the IMF since 2011. And in 2016, the RMB joined the special drawing rights basket to reflect the importance of RMB in the global economy. But progress has been very slow in other areas. So what is the future of multilateralism? There's no doubt that multilateralism has been under attack. The irony is that the US, the country most responsible for the creation of many of the world's multilateral institutions, is leading the assault. And frankly, there's a lack of diplomacy. However, while it takes a great power to create multilateral institutions, running them may not require a clear leader. The US-led TPP became Japan-led CPTPP once the US withdrew. In fact, CPTPP will go into force at the end of the year after Australia became the sixth country to ratify it. Meanwhile, when the current US president announced that the US would pull out from the Paris Agreement, many feared the worst. But by the end of 2017, every country in the world had become a signatory to the agreement. Given the multitude and the magnitude of the world's challenges, no one country will get far going at it alone. At the same time, we must expect countries to put their own interests first. What we must do is to update, not abandon, the current rule-based multilateral system so that it is fit to serve the increasingly multipolar world. And to that, we can work together and find solutions for trade disputes, climate change, and other global issues. Here are a few suggestions. First and foremost, it is important to remember that multilateralism, regionalism, and bilateralism are not mutually exclusive, especially in a multipolar world. Let's take the infrastructure investment as an example. The Asian Development Bank believes that Asia-Pacific requires $1.7 trillion per year in infrastructure investment if the region is to maintain its growth momentum. This is more than any single multilateral financial institution can fund, which is why the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank should not be seen as competing with or supplanting the existing multilateral institutions. While existing institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank must change the way they work to reflect the needs of emerging economies, new institutions such as the AIIB and the New Development Bank should be given the freedom to support global and regional development. In the long term, for the Belt and Road Initiative to succeed and for the countries along the routes to benefit, its financing cannot solely come from China or Chinese policy banks or Chinese corporations. It must involve both the public and the private sectors, both developed economies and emerging markets, and both existing and new multilateral institutions. While global issues such as climate change can be dealt with more effectively at a multilateral level, rule-making in cross-border trade and investment may achieve more progress at a bilateral or regional level. For example, the CPTPP and the USMCA are ahead of the WTO in terms of addressing the issues such as digital trade and e-commerce. My second suggestion is reform. Most countries prefer the idea of accommodation than confrontation. Yet, we need to make sure that the countries feel that they have more to gain by being part of the system rather than outside the system. Multilateralism needs to be reformed so that it's more representative of the increasingly multipolar world. Asia, especially emerging Asia, must be allowed to play a more prominent role that reflects its increased economic and financial weight. At a more technical level, the WTO must proceed with reforms. The US has rebuked the WTO by slapping tariffs on friends and foes alike, but it is far from the only country that is dissatisfied with the WTO. The list of grievances is long. Dispute settlement is too slow. The use of subsidies isn't adequately disciplined. Some members provide only weak enforcement of intellectual property rights. So without reform, the WTO risks being marginalized as members increasingly settle disputes outside the multilateral framework. Finally, for multilateralism to survive this current episode and thrive hereafter, Asia must be given a more prominent role. And Asia, after being given a more prominent role, Asia must play a more prominent role. Yet, at the same time, Asia itself must conform to the requirements of the rule-based system. There's a quote that's been attributed to everyone from Voltaire to Teddy Roosevelt to Winston Churchill and even to Spider-Man's uncle. And it is, with great power comes great responsibility. While Asia rightfully deserves to have more seats at the table, it must also be more active in helping to sustain the current multilateral institutions. Only by working collaboratively can one advance shared interests. The AIIB is a good example. Its creation was spearheaded by China, but it is governed by a board designed to reassure China's partners that Beijing will not exert dominance. As Asia continues to grow and develop, it must assume more roles and responsibilities on the global stage, whether it's protecting the integrity of global financial system or facilitating cross-border trade and goods and as well as services, or responding to the threat of climate change. For multilateralism to function properly, the multilateralism to benefit every party requires unity and it requires cohesion. More importantly, it requires reform. Since the end of the World War II, multilateralism has helped the world achieve great social and economic progress. Current headwinds seems to be getting stronger, but let's face it. Today's problem didn't start with the current US president, and they will not magically disappear when his term ends. We must remember that multilateral cooperation provides a venue to resolve differences peacefully, a platform to agree on common rules, a mechanism to better manage international flows, and a channel for exchange of ideas, experiences, and practices so that countries learn from each other. In short, it's very simple. People have to talk to each other to gain better understanding of the opportunities and challenges. Instead of abandoning it, we must look to reform it. Hence, I call a reformation, a 21st century reformation of the current multilateral system. So thank you very much, and I hope the trade war would end, Brexit will end very nicely, and the world will be at peace. Thank you.